Our new governor, Captain Denny, brought me the medal from the Royal Society that I mentioned earlier. He gave it to me at a party the city threw for him. He also said very nice things about how much he respected me, claiming he had known about my reputation for a long time. After dinner, when everyone was, as was common back then, busy drinking, he pulled me aside into another room. He told me that his friends in England had advised him to become friends with me, saying I was someone who could give him the best advice and help make his job as governor much easier. He said he really wanted us to get along well, and asked me to believe that he was ready to help me in any way he could, any time. He also talked a lot about how well the proprietor felt about the province, and how beneficial it would be for all of us, especially me, if the long-standing opposition to his plans stopped and everyone got along. He implied that I was the best person to make that happen, and that I could expect fair recognition and rewards and so on. The people drinking, noticing we hadn't come back to the table right away, sent us a bottle of Madeira. The governor drank a lot of it, and the more he drank, the more he poured out his requests and promises. My response was basically this, that thankfully I was doing well enough that I didn't need any special favors from the proprietor. Also, as a member of the assembly, I couldn't possibly accept any. However, I told him I didn't personally dislike the proprietor, and that whenever his proposed public policies seemed to benefit the people, no one would support and promote them more enthusiastically than I would. My previous opposition was based on the fact that the policies being pushed clearly aimed to benefit the proprietor, which would significantly harm the people. I also told him, the governor, that I was very grateful for his kind words towards me, and that he could count on me to do everything I could to make his job as easy as possible. At the same time, I hoped he hadn't come with the same problematic instructions that had caused so much trouble for the previous governor. He didn't explain himself further on that point then, but later, when he started working with the assembly, those issues resurfaced, the arguments began again, and I was as involved as ever in opposing them. I was the one who wrote, first, the request to see his instructions, and then the comments on those instructions, which you can find in the records from that time and in the historical review I published later. But personally, we didn't have any hard feelings. We often spent time together. He was a well-educated man, had traveled a lot, and was very engaging and enjoyable to talk to. He was the first to tell me that my old friend James Ralph was still alive, that he was considered one of England's best political writers, had worked on the disagreement between Prince Frederick and the King, and was getting a pension of $300 a year. He also mentioned that Ralph wasn't very famous as a poet, since Pope had criticized his poetry, but his prose was thought to be as good as anyone's.
The assembly eventually realized that the proprietor stubbornly kept tying the hands of their representatives with rules that went against not only the people's rights, but also the king's interests. So they decided to formally complain to the king about them and chose me as their representative to go to England to deliver and support this complaint. The House had sent a bill to the governor offering £60,000 for the king's use, with £10,000 of that amount subject to the orders of the general at the time, Lord Loudon. The governor flat out refused to approve it, following his instructions. I had arranged my trip with Captain Morris, who ran the mailboat service in New York, and my supplies were already on board when Lord Loudon arrived in Philadelphia. He told me he came specifically to try and work out a deal between the governor and the assembly, so that their disagreements wouldn't get in the way of the king's business. So he asked the governor and me to meet him so he could hear both sides of the story. We met and talked things over. On behalf of the assembly, I presented all the different arguments that you can find in the public documents from that period, which I wrote and are printed with the assembly's official records. The governor, on the other hand, brought up his instructions, the promise he had made to follow them, and how he'd be ruined if he didn't. Still, he seemed somewhat open to taking a risk if Lord Loudon suggested it. Lord Loudon, however, decided not to advise him to do that, even though I thought I had almost convinced him. Instead, he chose to push the Assembly to cooperate. He begged me to try and persuade them, stating that he wouldn't use any of the king's soldiers to defend our borders, and if we didn't keep funding our own defense, we'd be left vulnerable to the enemy.
I informed the House about what had happened and gave them a set of resolutions I had written. These resolutions stated our rights and made it clear that we weren't giving up those rights, but only temporarily putting them aside for this particular situation, which we formally objected to. Eventually, they agreed to drop that bill and create a new one that followed the proprietor's instructions. The governor, of course, approved this new bill, and I was then free to continue my journey. However, in the meantime, the mailboat had already left with my supplies for the trip, which was a bit of a loss for me. My only reward was Lord Loudon's thanks for my help, with all the credit for reaching the agreement going to him. He left for New York before me. Since he controlled when the mailboats departed, and there were two still there, one of which he said would sail very soon, I asked for the exact departure time so I wouldn't miss it due to any delay on my part. His answer was, "I've announced that it will sail next Saturday, but I can tell you that if you're there by Monday morning, you'll be on time, but don't wait any longer." Due to an unexpected delay at a ferry, I didn't arrive until Monday noon. I was very worried the ship might have already left since the wind was good. But I was quickly relieved to hear that it was still in the harbor and wouldn't leave until the next day. You'd think I was finally about to leave for Europe. I certainly thought so, but I wasn't yet familiar with his lordship's personality, of which tardiness was one of the most prominent traits. I'll give a few examples. I arrived in New York around the beginning of April, and I believe it was almost the end of June before we actually sailed. There were two mailboats that had been in port for a long time, but they were held up waiting for the general's letters, which were always promised to be ready tomorrow. Another mailboat arrived. It was also held up. And before we sailed, a fourth was expected. Ours was supposed to be the first to leave, since it had been there the longest. Passengers were booked on all of them, and some were extremely eager to go, while merchants were anxious about their letters and the insurance orders they had placed, it being wartime, for autumn goods. But their worry didn't help. His lordship's letters weren't ready. Yet anyone who visited him always found him at his desk, pen in hand, and assumed he must be writing a huge amount. One morning, when I went to pay my respects, I found a messenger from Philadelphia named Innes in his waiting room. Innes had come directly from there with a package from Governor Denny for the general. He gave me some letters from my friends back home, which made me ask when he was returning and where he was staying, so I could send some letters with him. He told me he was instructed to come back tomorrow at 9 for the general's reply to the governor, and would leave right away. I gave him my letters that same day. 2 weeks later, I ran into him again in the same spot. "So, you're back already, Innes?" "No, I'm not yet." "How can that be? I've been told to come here every morning for the past 2 weeks for his lordship's letter, and it's still not ready." "Is that possible, considering he writes so much? I always see him at his writing desk." "Yes," Innes replied, "but he's like St. George on the signs." It seems the messenger's comment was accurate, for later, when I was in England, I learned that Mr. Pitt cited this as one reason for replacing this general and sending Generals Amherst and Wolfe instead. With the constant expectation of sailing and all 3 mailboats heading down to Sandy Hook to meet the fleet there, the passengers decided it was best to get on board just in case the ships suddenly left and they were stranded. If I recall correctly, we stayed there for about 6 weeks, using up our travel supplies and having to buy more. Finally, the fleet sailed, with the general and his entire army on board, heading to Louisburg with the goal of attacking and capturing that fort. All the mailboats were ordered to stay with the general's ship, ready to pick up his messages whenever they were prepared. We were at sea for 5 days before we received a letter giving us permission to leave. Then our ship left the fleet and headed for England. The general kept the other 2 mailboats, taking them with him to Halifax, where he spent some time training his men with fake attacks on fake forts. Then he changed his mind about attacking Louisburg and returned to New York with all his troops, along with the 2 mailboats I mentioned and all their passengers. While he was away, the French and Native Americans had captured Fort George on the province's border, and the Native Americans had killed many of the soldiers after they surrendered. Later, in London, I saw Captain Bonnell, who commanded one of those mailboats. He told me that after being held up for a month, he informed his lordship that his ship's hull had become so dirty that it would definitely slow down its speed, which was crucial for a mailboat. He asked for time to pull the ship out of the water and clean its bottom. He was asked how long that would take. He replied, 3 days. The general responded, "If you can do it in 1 day, I'll allow it. Otherwise, no, because you absolutely must sail the day after tomorrow." So, he never got permission, even though he was then held up day after day for a full 3 months. I also saw one of Bonnell's passengers in London. He was so furious with his lordship for misleading and delaying him for so long in New York, and then taking him to Halifax and back again, that he swore he would sue him for compensation. I never found out if he actually did, but based on how he described the harm to his business, it was quite significant. Overall, I really wondered how such a man ended up being trusted with such a crucial job as leading a large army. But since then, having seen more of how the world works and how people get important positions and why those positions are given, my surprise has lessened. General Shirley, who took command of the army after Braddock died, would have, in my opinion, led a much better campaign than Loudon's in 1757 if he had stayed in charge. Loudon's campaign was pointless, costly, and incredibly shameful for our nation. Even though Shirley wasn't a trained soldier, he was smart and wise on his own, listened to good advice from others, could create well-thought-out plans, and was quick and effective at putting them into action. Loudon, instead of defending the colonies with his large army, left them completely vulnerable while he just wasted time in Halifax. Because of this, Fort George was lost. Plus, he messed up all our business dealings and hurt our trade by placing a long ban on exporting food. He claimed this was to prevent the enemy from getting supplies, but in reality, it was to drive down the prices for the contractors, in whose profits, it was rumored, though perhaps only suspected, he had a share. And when the ban was finally lifted, by failing to notify Charleston, the Carolina fleet was held up for almost 3 more months. As a result, their ship bottoms were so badly damaged by shipworms that many of them sank on their way home. I believe Shirley was genuinely happy to be freed from such a heavy responsibility, as leading an army must be for someone unfamiliar with military matters. I was at the party the city of New York threw for Lord Loudon when he took command. Shirley, even though he had been replaced, was also there. There was a large crowd of officers, citizens, and visitors. Some chairs had been borrowed from the neighborhood, and one of them was very low. That one ended up being for Mr. Shirley. Noticing it as I sat next to him, I said, "Sir, they've given you a seat that's too low." He replied, "It's fine, Mr. Franklin. I find it the most comfortable." While I was, as I mentioned before, stuck in New York, I received all the bills and records for the supplies I had provided to Braddock. Some of these couldn't be gotten sooner from the various people I had hired to help with the task. I gave them to Lord Loudon, asking to be paid the remaining amount.
He had them properly checked by the right official, who, after comparing each item with its receipt, confirmed they were correct. Lord Loudon promised to give me an order for the outstanding balance to be paid by the paymaster. However, this kept getting delayed, and even though I called for it many times by appointment, I never got it. Finally, just before I left, he told me that after thinking it over, he had decided not to combine his accounts with those of the previous commanders. He said, "And you, when you're in England, just need to show your accounts at the Treasury and you'll be paid right away." I brought up, but it didn't help, the large and unexpected costs I had incurred by being held up so long in New York, as a reason why I wanted to be paid immediately. And when I pointed out that it wasn't fair for me to face any more trouble or delays in getting back the money I had advanced, especially since I didn't charge any fee for my service, he said, "Oh, sir, you mustn't try to convince us that you didn't profit. We understand these matters better, and know that everyone involved in supplying the army finds ways to line their own pockets." I assured him that wasn't true for me, and that I hadn't taken a single penny, but he clearly didn't believe me. And in fact, I've since learned that huge fortunes are often made in such jobs. As for the money I'm owed, I still haven't been paid to this day, but more on that later.
Before we sailed, our mailboat captain had bragged a lot about how fast his ship was. Unfortunately, once we were at sea, it turned out to be the slowest of 96 ships, which was quite embarrassing for him. After many guesses about why, when we were near another ship almost as slow as ours, but which was still catching up to us, the captain ordered everyone to come to the back of the ship and stand as close to the flagpole as possible. Including passengers, there were about 40 of us. While we stood there, the ship picked up speed and soon left the other ship far behind. This clearly proved what our captain suspected, that the ship was too heavy at the front. It seems all the water barrels had been placed forward. So he ordered them to be moved further back, which made the ship perform much better, and it ended up being the fastest in the fleet.
The captain claimed his ship had once traveled at 13 knots, which is considered 13 miles per hour. We had Captain Kennedy from the Navy on board as a passenger, who argued that this was impossible, that no ship ever sailed that fast, and that there must have been a mistake in how the log line was marked or in how the log was thrown. A bet was made between the two captains to be settled when there was enough wind. Kennedy then carefully checked the log line, and satisfied with it, he decided to throw the log himself. So, a few days later, when the wind was blowing very nicely and strongly, and Captain Ludwig of the mailboat said he believed the ship was then going at 13 knots, Kennedy performed the test and admitted he lost the bet. I'm sharing the above story to make the following point. It's been noted as a flaw in shipbuilding that you can never know if a new ship will be fast or slow until it's actually tested. For example, a new ship built exactly like a known fast one has sometimes turned out to be surprisingly slow. I think this might partly be because sailors have different ideas about how to load, rig, and sail a ship. Each captain has their own method, and the same ship, loaded and managed by one captain, will sail differently than when handled by another. Plus, it's rare for the same person to design, prepare for sea, and then sail a ship. One person builds the body, another sets up the sails and ropes, and a third loads and sails it. None of these individuals fully understands all the ideas and experiences of the others, so they can't make accurate decisions based on the complete picture. Even with something as basic as sailing at sea, I've often noticed that officers in charge of different shifts had different ideas, even when the wind was the same. One would adjust the sails more sharply or more loosely than another, making it seem like there was no clear rule to follow. Still, I believe a series of experiments could be set up. First, to figure out the best shape for a ship's hull for fast sailing. Next, the ideal size and placement for the masts. Then, the the shape and amount of sails and how they should be positioned depending on the wind, and finally, how the cargo should be arranged. This is a time for experiments, and I believe a carefully conducted and combined set of them would be very helpful. I am convinced, therefore, that before long, some clever thinker will take this on, and I wish them success.
We were chased several times during our journey, but we outran everything, and within 30 days we were in shallow enough water to measure the depth. We had a good reading, and the captain thought we were so close to our port, Falmouth, that if we sailed well through the night, we could be at the harbor entrance by morning. By sailing at night, we might also avoid enemy privateers, who often patrolled near the channel entrance. So we put up every sail we possibly could, and with a strong, favorable wind, we sailed straight ahead and made excellent progress. After his observation, the captain set his course, he believed, to pass well clear of the Scilly Isles. But it seems there's sometimes a strong current that flows up St. George's Channel, which misleads sailors and caused the loss of Sir Cloudesley Shovel's fleet. This current was probably what caused our incident. We had a lookout stationed at the front of the ship, whom they often called out to, and he would often reply. But perhaps he had his eyes closed and was half asleep at the time, sometimes answering, as they say, automatically, because he didn't see a light directly in front of us, which had been hidden by the extra sails from the helmsman and the rest of the watch. But then the ship suddenly swerved, and the light was spotted, causing a huge panic. We were very close to it, and the light looked as big as a cartwheel to me. It was midnight, and our captain was fast asleep, but Captain Kennedy jumped onto the deck, saw the danger, and ordered the ship to turn sharply around, with all sails still up. This was a risky maneuver for the masts, but it got us out of trouble, and we avoided a shipwreck, because we were heading straight for the rocks where the lighthouse stood. This escape really made me appreciate how useful lighthouses are, and I would push for more of them to be built.
In the morning, by checking the water depth and other signs, we found we were near our port, but a thick fog hid the land from view. Around 9 o'clock, the fog started to lift, seeming to rise from the water like a theater curtain, revealing below it the town of Falmouth, the ships in its harbor, and the surrounding fields. This was a truly delightful sight for those of us who had seen nothing but the endless, empty ocean for so long. It brought us even more joy because we were now free from the worries caused by the war. My son and I immediately left for London. We only stopped briefly along the way to see Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain and Lord Pembroke's house and gardens at Wilton, which had a very interesting collection of old artifacts. We arrived in London on July 27th, 1757.
As soon as I settled into the place Mr. Charles had arranged for me, I went to visit Dr. Fothergill. I had a strong recommendation to him and was advised to get his opinion on how I should proceed. He was against immediately complaining to the government. He thought the proprietors should be approached directly first, as they might be convinced by some private friends to settle things peacefully. I then visited my old friend and correspondent, Mr. Peter Collinson, who told me that John Hanbury, the prominent Virginia merchant, had asked to be informed of my arrival so he could take me to Lord Granville's. Lord Granville was then the president of the council and wanted to see me as soon as possible. I agreed to go with him the next morning. So Mr. Hanbury picked me up and took me in his carriage to the nobleman's house, where I was received very politely. After some questions about the current situation in America and a discussion about it, he told me, "You Americans have the wrong idea about your government structure. You argue that the king's instructions to his governors aren't laws, and you think you're free to follow or ignore them as you please. But those instructions aren't like the casual notes given to a diplomat going abroad to handle some minor ceremonial detail. They are first drafted by legal experts, then reviewed,
debated, and possibly changed by the council, after which the king signs them. So as far as they concern you, they are the law, because the king is the legislator." I told his lordship this was a new idea to me. I had always understood from our charters that our laws were to be made by our assemblies, and indeed presented to the king for his approval. But once approved, the king couldn't cancel or change them. And just as the assemblies couldn't make permanent laws without his approval, he couldn't make a law for them without theirs. He assured me I was completely mistaken. I didn't think so, however, and his lordship's conversation made me a little worried about what the court's views on us might be. So I wrote it down as soon as I returned to my lodgings. I remembered that about 20 years earlier, a clause in a bill introduced in Parliament by the government had proposed making the King's instructions laws in the colonies. But the House of Commons rejected that clause, for which we admired them as our friends and champions of liberty. However, by their actions towards us in 1765, it seemed they had only denied that power to the king so they could keep it for themselves. After a few days, Dr. Fothergill spoke to the proprietors, and they agreed to meet with me at Mr. T. Penn's house in Spring Garden. The conversation initially involved both sides saying they were open to reasonable compromises. But I suspect each party had their own idea of what reasonable accommodations meant. We then started discussing our various complaints, which I listed. The proprietors defended their actions as best they could, and I defended the assemblies. We seemed very far apart in our opinions, so much so that it discouraged any hope of an agreement. However, we decided that I should give them a written summary of our complaints, and they promised to consider them. I did so soon after, but they handed the paper over to their lawyer, Ferdinand John Paris. He handled all their legal affairs, including their major lawsuit with the neighboring proprietor of Maryland, Lord Baltimore, which had been going on for 70 years. And he wrote all their documents and messages in their dispute with the assembly. He was a proud, angry man, and since I had occasionally criticized his papers quite harshly in the assembly's responses, as they were genuinely weak in argument and arrogant in tone, he had developed a deep hatred for me. This animosity showed itself whenever we met. So I declined the proprietor's suggestion that he and I discuss the complaints ourselves, and I refused to deal with anyone but the proprietors directly. They then, following his advice, gave the paper to the Attorney and Solicitor General for their opinion and advice. It remained unanswered for almost a year minus 8 days. During that time, I repeatedly asked the proprietors for a response, but I only ever heard that they hadn't yet received the Attorney and Solicitor General's opinion. I never learned what that opinion was when they finally got it, because they didn't share it with me. Instead, they sent a long message to the Assembly, drafted and signed by Paris, which quoted my paper, complained about its lack of proper format as being rude on my part, and offered a flimsy justification for their own actions. They added that they would be willing to settle things if the Assembly would send someone else to negotiate with them for that purpose, implying that I was not the right person. The lack of proper format or rudeness was probably because I hadn't addressed the paper to them using their self-proclaimed titles of true and absolute proprietors of the province of Pennsylvania, which I left out because I didn't think it was necessary in a document whose only purpose was to put into writing, clearly and precisely, what I had already said in person. But during this delay, the Assembly had convinced Governor Denny to approve a law that taxed the proprietor's property just like everyone else's property, which was the main issue they were fighting over. Because of this, they didn't bother to reply to the message. However, when this law arrived, the proprietors, advised by Paris, decided to fight against it getting royal approval. So they formally complained to the King's Council, and a hearing was scheduled.
2 lawyers were hired by them to argue against the law, and 2 by me to support it. They claimed that the law was designed to heavily tax the proprietor's property to lighten the burden on the people, and that if it remained in effect and the proprietors, who were unpopular with the people, were left to their mercy in setting taxes, they would definitely be ruined. We replied that the law had no such intention and wouldn't have that effect. We argued that the tax assessors were honest and sensible men sworn to assess fairly and equally, and that any small benefit each of them might get by lowering their own tax at the expense of the proprietors was too insignificant to make them commit perjury. This is essentially what I remember both sides arguing, except that we strongly emphasized the damaging consequences of repealing the law. We pointed out that the money, £100,000, had already been printed, given for the king's use, spent in his service, and was now circulating among the people. Repealing it would make that money worthless in their hands, ruining many and completely discouraging any future grants. We also strongly highlighted the proprietor's selfishness in pushing for such a widespread disaster just because of an unfounded fear that their property would be taxed too much.
At this point, Lord Mansfield, one of the lawyers, stood up, motioned to me, and took me into the clerk's office while the other lawyers were still arguing. He asked me if I truly believed that the proprietor's estate wouldn't be harmed by implementing the law. I said, certainly. Then, he said, you shouldn't have much of a problem agreeing to a commitment to guarantee that point. I answered, none at all. He then called in Paris, and after some discussion, his lordship's proposal was accepted by both sides. A document outlining this agreement was prepared by the clerk of the council, which I signed along with Mr. Charles, who was also an agent for the province's regular affairs. Lord Mansfield then returned to the council chamber, where the law was finally allowed to pass. However, some changes were recommended, and we also agreed that these changes would be made by a later law. But the Assembly didn't think them necessary. Since 1 year's tax had already been collected under the law before the council's order arrived, they appointed a committee to review the assessor's work, and they put several close friends of the proprietors on this committee. After a thorough investigation, they unanimously signed a report stating that they found the tax had been assessed with perfect fairness. The Assembly considered my agreement to the first part of the commitment a vital service to the province, as it protected the value of the paper money circulating throughout the country at the time. They formally thanked me when I returned. But the proprietors were furious with Governor Denny for passing the law and fired him, threatening to sue him for breaking the instructions he had promised to follow. However, since he had done it at the general's request and for the king's service, and also had powerful connections at court, he ignored the threats, and they were never carried out.